Imagine a civilization so mighty, it commands entire galaxies and rules with an iron fist. Yet, when this unstoppable empire threatens a seemingly insignificant species, they're in for a shock. The Kian Empire, feared across the cosmos, declared war on humanity for refusing to surrender a barren planet on the edge of their solar system, only to face something they never expected: laughter. In a universe where power and technology reigned supreme, discover how humanity's resilience and ingenuity turned the tide, forcing the mightiest empire to question everything about strength, evolution, and survival. Stay tuned, the next chapter could change the fate of the galaxy forever. The Kian Empire, with its vast power and control over galaxies, ruled with fear and strength. For centuries, they believed no one could challenge them. However, when they encountered Earth, they saw an opportunity. 1,000 years ago, Earth's ancestors signed a peace treaty with the Kians. The treaty was meant to keep the humans isolated and prevent them from advancing too quickly. For years, the Kians watched from afar, believing humanity was still primitive. But the treaty kept them from directly interacting with Earth. As the treaty expired, the Kians saw it as the right time to conquer Earth. They declared war, demanding exclusive mining rights to an uninhabited rock in the solar system. What happened next stunned them. Instead of fearing the Kians, the humans laughed. Admiral Tessa Monroe, leading Earth's defense, questioned their war declaration. She laughed and said, "You are declaring war on us because we refuse to give you mining rights to a rock." This reaction confused Zorak, the Kian supreme commander. How could humans laugh at such a powerful empire? He expected fear, not humor. Zorak's surprise grew as he realized that humans might be stronger than he thought. The Kians had underestimated Earth's potential, and this moment marked the beginning of a conflict that would change everything. The Kians had planned for a quick conquest, but humanity had a surprise in store. As the Kian armada prepared to invade Earth, Zorak, the supreme commander, couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. He had expected humanity to cower in fear, but instead, they had laughed. The Kians had been watching Earth from a distance for 1,000 years, believing that humanity was still a primitive species. When they first encountered humans, Earth's technology was far behind. They had just mastered spaceflight, used chemical-based weapons, and had crude medical practices. The Kians thought they had plenty of time before humans could become a serious threat. But now, the Kians were facing something unexpected. Admiral Monroe had revealed that humans had been studying the Kian Empire for centuries, even without direct contact. They knew the Kians' strategies, technologies, and military tactics better than Zorak ever imagined. The humans had been preparing for this moment for a long time. Instead of fearing the mighty Kian Empire, they stood strong, confident, and ready for battle. Zorak's intelligence director, Lura, struggled to explain why the humans weren't intimidated. Their military capabilities were still unclear, but they had detected unusual energy readings from Earth. Could it be that humans had advanced far faster than the Kians realized? Zorak's frustration grew. How could a species that was once so primitive now stand in the face of the Kian Empire with such confidence? This was no longer just about a small mining rock in the solar system. It was about a struggle for survival, and Zorak could no longer underestimate humanity. As the Kian armada continued its journey toward Earth, Zorak's frustration grew. The Kians had always prided themselves on their superior strength, their overwhelming numbers, and their ability to conquer. But as they drew closer to the Sol system, Zorak began to doubt his initial assumptions about the humans. The transmission from Admiral Monroe, filled with mockery and confidence, played over and over in his mind. Why weren't the humans frightened? Was there something he was missing? Zorak ordered the armada to approach Earth, but as they neared Saturn's rings, something strange happened. His science officer, Krell, reported anomalous energy readings coming from the rings of Saturn. They were no longer just ice and rock. Something was moving within them. The rings were shifting, reforming, and transforming. In an instant, Zorak realized the truth. The humans had been hiding something in plain sight. Millions of ships, disguised as parts of the Saturn rings, began to emerge. These weren't just any ships. They were fully functional, autonomous, and ready for battle. Zorak's heart sank as the reality hit him. The humans had prepared for this moment long before the Kians arrived. They had hidden their entire fleet within Saturn's rings, waiting patiently for the right time to strike. Admiral Monroe appeared on the screen again. smiling as if she had expected this all along. Zorak was left speechless. How could the humans have built so many ships without the Kians noticing? They had been underestimated. The Kian Empire was now facing an enemy that was not just prepared but far more advanced than they had ever imagined. As the Kian armada was caught off guard by the hidden human fleet, Zorak struggled to regain his composure. The human vessels, which were far smaller than his massive warships, moved with incredible precision and agility. They didn't just evade the Kian fire, they danced through space, dodging attacks in ways that seemed almost impossible. Zorak's officers were confused, stunned by how efficiently the human ships maneuvered. Science Officer Krell finally realized the truth. The human ships weren't piloted by organic beings. They were autonomous, controlled by advanced artificial intelligence. The ships had been running combat simulations for nearly 1,000 years, honing their abilities to defeat the Kian fleet. Zorak watched in disbelief as the humans' AI vessels outmaneuvered his entire fleet. Admiral Monroe, still smiling confidently, casually mentioned that the human fleet had been prepared for a long time. They had developed their technology to such an extent that their ships could ignore the Kian defenses entirely. Zorak's forces had no way to stop them. The human ships phased right through the Kian warships' defense shields, making contact with the metal hulls, and within moments, entire Kian ships disintegrated into clouds of atoms. Zorak, unable to comprehend what he was witnessing, knew this was not just advanced technology, it was something beyond his understanding. The humans had developed a kind of quantum technology that allowed their ships to exist in multiple states of matter at once, making them nearly untouchable by conventional weapons. This was no longer just a battle of might, it was a battle of wits, and the Kian Empire was on the verge of losing. In the wake of the devastating encounter, the Kian Armada's supreme commander, Zorak, faced a dilemma unlike any he had ever encountered. His entire fleet, the mightiest in the universe, had been rendered almost helpless by the mysterious technology of the humans. As his warships limped away from the battlefield, Zorak's mind raced. Trying to piece together the unimaginable defeat, he couldn't help but wonder why the humans had laughed at his empire's declaration of war. It had been an arrogant and dismissive laugh, not the reaction of a species about to face extinction. Their confidence baffled him. The humans had not only outmatched his forces, but had done so with a calm assurance that made his warriors question everything they thought they knew about power. Zorak spent the following weeks in deep contemplation. He could not ignore the fact that the human fleet had been so advanced, yet they didn't seem to have the same thirst for conquest that the Kian Empire had. Instead, the humans had displayed a strange kind of curiosity, a drive to explore and develop, rather than to dominate others. Zorak began to realize that the humans had been far more prepared than he had anticipated. The Kian Empire, despite its vast resources and military strength, had stagnated over the years, relying on the power of past conquests rather than creating something new. And now, for the first time, Zorak felt the weight of this realization. His empire was vulnerable. The humans, on the other hand, had not just survived, they had thrived. Their technological advancements left the Kian forces in the dust, forcing Zorak to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Kian Empire was no longer the dominant force it once was. Zorak's realization sent ripples through the Kian Empire, but it wasn't just a personal reflection. As the supreme commander, he had to act. The defeat had shaken the very foundation of the Kian leadership. For centuries, the empire had ruled, through sheer force, conquering galaxies with an iron fist. But now, faced with the shocking display of human technology, Zorak knew they had to change. A meeting of the highest-ranking Kian officers was called. Zorak stood before them, his towering figure imposing, but his words were laced with uncertainty. For the first time in decades, he spoke of the humans' ability to innovate and adapt at an astonishing speed. He admitted that the Kian Empire had grown complacent, relying on its military might and resources instead of fostering true scientific progress. The Kian's empire, once built on conquest, had ignored the very thing that could have kept them ahead: innovation. Zorak proposed something that was unheard of in Kian history, a shift in priorities. Rather than focusing solely on military conquest, the Kian Empire needed to invest in research, scientific exploration, and technological advancement. They had to evolve, or they risked being left behind by a species that had advanced in just 1,000 years in ways the Kian Empire couldn't even fathom. This was a turning point. The Kian Empire, with its pride and centuries of conquest, had to learn humility. Zorik's challenge was not only to change the way the empire thought about power, but to convince his people that they could no longer rely solely on brute force. This was the moment that the Kian Empire had to decide, adapt, or face inevitable extinction. In the aftermath of Zorik's proposal to the Kian High Council, a great debate began to unfold. The idea of shifting from the Kian Empire's long-standing tradition of conquest to a more scientific approach was revolutionary, but it wasn't universally accepted. Some officers, especially those with deep ties to the empire's military doctrine, were skeptical. For centuries, their dominance had been built on strength, fear, and the ability to overpower any opposition. The concept of evolution through knowledge and cooperation seemed foreign to them, almost like a betrayal of everything they had fought for. However, there were others among the council who understood the implications of what Zorik was suggesting. They saw the humans' incredible technological advancements and realized that the Kian Empire's reliance on warfare alone would eventually lead to its downfall. The humans had demonstrated something the Kian had never considered: the power of collaboration, exploration, and development. The Kian Empire's single-minded focus on conquering had left them vulnerable to an unexpected force. A force that wasn't interested in ruling over others, but rather in advancing through mutual growth. The discussion grew heated, but there was a growing recognition that Zorik's proposal might be the only way forward. It wasn't just about avoiding defeat, it was about securing a future where the Kian Empire could not only survive, but thrive alongside other species. And so, despite the pushback from many, a vote was taken, and the High Council agreed to follow Zorik's plan. The empire would restructure its priorities, and the age of unchecked conquest would be replaced with an era of scientific exploration, innovation, and cooperation. The Kian Empire was about to change, but the road ahead would not be easy. The decision to pivot from conquest to scientific development was groundbreaking, but it came with its own set of challenges. The Kian Empire, a civilization built on thousands of years of military might, had little experience in diplomacy or research collaboration. For centuries, they had ruled with an iron fist, conquering planets and systems without ever having to compromise or negotiate. This shift in strategy required the Kian leadership to reconsider their long-standing beliefs and cultural values. Zorak, still deeply shaken by the events on Earth, knew that this transformation would not be easy. The Kian military, which had long been the backbone of the Empire's strength, was now facing a different kind of threat. It wasn't just about overpowering other species, it was about understanding, learning, and evolving. However, convincing the rest of the empire to embrace this new path would take time. There were many who still believed in the superiority of the Kian way through domination, through fear, and through power. For the first time, the Kian Empire had to confront the reality that their way of life might not be sustainable. Zorak saw the future of the empire, and it was no longer a future filled with endless wars and triumphs. Instead, it was a future of learning and growth, not just for the Kian species, but for the entire galaxy. He knew that if they wanted to survive the looming threats, they would have to evolve beyond their old ways. It wasn't just about military might anymore. It was about embracing change and working alongside others. This decision marked the beginning of the Kian Empire's greatest challenge: adapting to a new reality where knowledge, not brute force, would determine their place in the galaxy. And Zorak, for the first time in his life, felt the weight of the future upon him. Zorak's proposal to shift the Kian Empire's focus from conquest to scientific advancement was not received well by all. Many of the Empire's military leaders, steeped in the traditions of war and domination, could not fathom the idea of turning away from their proven methods. They were accustomed to the idea that strength, control, and expansion were the keys to the Kian Empire's greatness. The very concept of peaceful cooperation with other species seemed foreign, even absurd. To them, however, as the Kian leaders mulled over Zorik's words, a surprising realization began to settle in. The more they discussed it, the more they understood the weight of the human challenge. The humans, a species once thought to be insignificant, had developed technologies and strategies that the Kian Empire could not match. Not only had they adapted quickly, but they had also evolved their thinking, innovating innovation rather than conquest, knowledge rather than power. Zorik's view was clear: The Kian Empire could not continue to exist solely by conquering others. They had reached a point where their own growth was stunted by their reliance on military strength. If they were to stand a chance against the greater forces that were watching, they had to evolve. The choice was clear: embrace knowledge and technological advancement, or face extinction. Slowly, the Empire's leadership began to see the merit in Zorak's vision. It was clear that the future would require more than just military strength. It would require wisdom, collaboration, and the willingness to adapt. The discussion was intense, but ultimately, it set the Kian Empire on a path toward a new kind of power, one rooted in knowledge and progress rather than in domination. As the Kian Empire's leadership shifted its focus, the reality of their new path began to settle in. Zorak's ideas, though initially met with resistance, slowly gained traction as the understanding of the necessity for change deepened. The traditional Kian mindset, which had been shaped over thousands of years by conquest and military might, was starting to give way to a more intellectual approach. The Empire's massive infrastructure, which had been built for war, now had the potential to be repurposed for research, development, and technological advancement. Zorak's proposal of dedicating resources to scientific discovery began to take root, but the next challenge was implementing this vision across the vast Kian Empire. The military leaders who had once fought battles across galaxies were now tasked with overseeing research projects. The process of shifting from military strategies to scientific endeavors was difficult, but not impossible. The first steps included building research centers, redirecting technological expertise, and encouraging collaboration with other species, especially humans. The most profound change, however, was in the Kian mindset. For centuries, they had believed that domination was the key to their survival and strength. Now, they were learning that survival in the universe required more than sheer force. It required wisdom, innovation, and the courage to evolve. The Kian Empire's newfound dedication to knowledge was a testament to the power of transformation. While the road ahead was uncertain, it was clear that the Empire had chosen a new path, one that could, if successful, secure its future and its place in the larger galactic community. Despite Zorak's progressive vision, the path forward wasn't without challenges. The resistance from the Empire's military elite remained strong. These individuals, who had spent their lives training for conquest and battle, found it difficult to accept the notion of scientific cooperation over military dominance. There were whispers in the corridors of power, doubts about whether the shift in priorities would make the Kian Empire weaker rather than stronger. Zorak's leadership faced skepticism from some of his closest advisors. They questioned if the Empire's military capabilities, which had been its core strength for millennia, could be preserved while focusing on intellectual pursuits. Could they still maintain their might and power if they began to value science and exploration over war? In these moments of doubt, Zorak leaned heavily on the support of Admiral Monroe and other human leaders. The alliance, though still fragile, was the key to overcoming these internal struggles. Zorak realized that not only would he need to battle external threats, but he would also have to confront internal resistance. He began to hold regular meetings with key military figures to emphasize the importance of scientific advancement and the threats that humanity had warned about. Slowly, the seeds of cooperation began to sprout, but the path to acceptance was long. As the Kian Empire grappled with this shift in focus, the larger galaxy seemed to hold its breath. Would the Kian Empire, once a symbol of fear and domination, truly evolve into a society where knowledge and peace took precedence? Only time would tell. As the Kian Empire's focus shifted from conquest to cooperation, the galaxy began to change in unexpected ways. The once feared empire that had conquered entire star systems now found itself re-evaluating its place in the universe. The shift from military dominance to scientific exploration was not just a change in priorities. It was a fundamental transformation in the way the Kian Empire interacted with the galaxy. Zorak understood that this shift would take time, but he believed it was necessary to ensure the survival of the Kian species. As they began collaborating with humanity, they learned about new technologies, cultures, and ways of thinking. They had been living in a bubble of dominance, blind to the broader picture. Now, the Empire could see that their future wasn't just about expanding their borders. It was about expanding their knowledge and understanding of the universe. With human knowledge and expertise, the Kian Empire began making breakthroughs in energy production, medicine, and space exploration. The once closed borders between species began to open, allowing for exchange and mutual growth. The alliance with humanity, while still fragile, started to show promise. It became clear that the Kian Empire's future would not be defined by its past wars but by its ability to adapt and cooperate. This new direction also put pressure on the Kian leadership. Zorak had to balance the desires of the military elite with the emerging vision of a future built on collaboration and scientific growth. Yet, despite the challenges, there was an undeniable sense of hope within the Empire. The galaxy, it seemed, was on the brink of a new era, and the Kian Empire was determined to be part of it. Even as the Kian Empire began to embrace change, a new, darker shadow loomed on the horizon. The peaceful future they were striving for might soon be disrupted by an unknown force, far more dangerous than anything they had encountered before. It wasn't just about the alliance with humanity or the technological advancements they were achieving. The galaxy was much bigger and more mysterious than they had ever realized, and there were forces at play that even the most advanced minds of the Kian Empire couldn't fully comprehend. Zorak had heard rumors, whispers among the highest ranks, of a presence beyond the known boundaries of the Kian Empire's reach. These were no ordinary threats. These were forces that could bend the very laws of physics, creatures or entities that existed beyond the comprehension of any species, including the humans they had begun to ally with. Admiral Monroe had spoken of these threats cryptically, hinting that both humans and Kians would need to work together to face them. But what exactly were they? Zorak couldn't ignore the growing feeling that the peace the Empire was savoring might soon be shattered. As much as the Kians wanted to change, to evolve, they couldn't ignore their instinct for survival. Now, the question was not just about cooperation with humans, it was about preparing for the unseen dangers ahead. Dangers that might challenge everything they knew about power, technology, and even existence itself. The alliance with humanity had given the Kian Empire a glimpse of hope, but the true test of their evolution would come when this new, unknown threat finally revealed itself. Would the Kian Empire be ready, or would they find themselves facing extinction once more? As the Kian Empire began to process the potential alliance with humanity, there was a noticeable shift in their internal dialogue. The Kians, once solely focused on conquest and military superiority, found themselves grappling with an entirely new way of thinking. Zorak's leadership had been defined by their unrelenting drive for domination across the galaxy. But now, with humanity's surprising technological advances and their own vulnerabilities exposed, the Kian Empire had no choice but to reconsider their priorities. The sudden realization that they had become stagnant, focusing solely on conquest, hit hard. For thousands of years, they had prided themselves on their ability to overwhelm and absorb other species, but they had forgotten the importance of innovation. Conquest had become their way of life, their tradition, but it was no longer enough to ensure their survival or future prosperity. The Kian Empire, while advanced, had reached a ceiling. In contrast, humanity, with its relatively short lifespan and constant drive for progress, had managed to break barriers that the Kians had never considered. Zorak and his council members could no longer deny the truth. To evolve, to avoid extinction, they needed to focus on more than just military might. They needed to embrace science, technology, and cooperation, things they had once dismissed as secondary to their conquest-driven existence. This was a tough pill to swallow. For an empire built on aggression and control, the idea of peace, innovation, and cultural exchange was foreign, but in the face of a greater threat, Zorak and his empire understood that survival would depend on their ability to adapt to a new way of thinking. The question was, could they change in time, or would they be consumed by their own hubris? As Zorak and the Kian Empire began to wrestle with the idea of changing their core values, a new offer emerged from the humans. Dr. Jackson Webb, a representative from Earth, arrived with a proposal that would shift the course of their future. The Kian Empire had been humiliated by their failed invasion, and the might of the human defenses had left them questioning everything they once believed about their superiority. Yet, the offer from Dr. Webb was not one of war or conquest, it was one of cooperation. The humans, who had been observing the Kians for centuries, understood that their own technological advances were far ahead of what the Kians had achieved. With this knowledge, they extended a hand to the Kian Empire, offering assistance in bridging the massive gap in their scientific and technological understanding. Dr. Webb brought with him a device that contained the full history of humanity's technological and scientific advancements a gift, not a weapon. This offer, however, came with conditions. The Kians were not given these advancements freely. They had to show a willingness to evolve and change. It was not about conquering or dominating. This was about building a partnership based on shared goals for the future. The humans had learned that competition alone wasn't enough to progress. They needed collaboration. The Kian Empire, shocked by this gesture, now stood at a crossroads. Accepting the offer would mean embracing a future that was different from their past, a future where cooperation and mutual growth would take the place of conquest and control. But Zorak was still torn. Could the Kians abandon their old ways, or would they reject this new path in favor of continuing their tradition of dominance? The fate of the Kian Empire rested on this decision. The decision Zorak faced was monumental. For centuries, the Kian Empire had thrived on conquest, expansion, and domination. Their military strength, unmatched by any other species, had made them believe that they were the pinnacle of power in the universe. But now, after the humiliation at the hands of humans, everything they had believed was being questioned. Could they evolve, or was their empire destined to collapse under its own weight? Zorak's mind raced as he absorbed Dr. Webb's offer. The idea of collaboration was foreign to him. It was against everything he had been taught as a Kian leader. Yet, in the pit of his stomach, Zorak couldn't ignore the growing realization that the Kian Empire had stagnated. Their progress had come to a halt, and the rest of the universe had passed them by. The humans, with their remarkable advancements, had shown that true power didn't lie in simply conquering but in evolving and learning from others. As Zorak looked at the device containing the knowledge of humanity's scientific and technological achievements, he could feel the weight of history pressing on him. If he rejected this offer, he would continue down the same path of decline. But if he accepted, he would have to change everything: how the Kians viewed power, how they governed, and how they interacted with the universe. It was a risk, but the greatest risks often lead to the greatest rewards. Zorak knew that the future of the Kian Empire depended on this choice. Would they accept the path of progress and cooperation, or would they choose to continue their aggressive, conquering ways? It was a question that would define the destiny of the entire Kian species. Zorak sat alone in his quarters, staring out at the vast expanse of space. The stars seemed to stretch forever, but his thoughts were trapped in a whirlwind of uncertainty. The Kian Empire, for all its might, was in a state of crisis. The humans had shown him a glimpse of something new, something far beyond the scope of their conquests. They had become a symbol of something Zorak had never understood: evolution. For generations, the Kians had prided themselves on their strength, their superiority. Conquest was their way of life. It was all they knew. Yet, the human encounter had shaken Zorak to his core. Their advancements in technology, the ability to create warships out of thin air, their ability to manipulate space and matter, was unlike anything the Kians had ever seen. It was no longer just about numbers or firepower. The humans had something else: adaptability, creativity, and an understanding of the universe that the Kians had long forgotten. As Zorak sat in the silence of his quarters, he couldn't help but question the foundation of his beliefs. For the first time in his life, he felt a deep sense of doubt. Could the Kian Empire still be relevant in a universe that was rapidly evolving without them? Were they truly the greatest empire, or had their time come and gone? This internal struggle weighed heavily on Zorak. The Kian way was ingrained in him, but the reality was undeniable. The humans had forced him to see the cracks in his empire's foundation, and for the first time, Zorak considered whether their path, one of collaboration and evolution, was the only way forward. Would he accept it, or would he continue to lead his people down a path of inevitable destruction? The weight of this decision would alter the course of the Kian Empire forever. Section 18 weeks passed after the encounter with the humans, but the memory of that day lingered heavily on Zorak's mind. The Kian Empire had always relied on its power, its ability to crush opponents through sheer force. But now, the words of Admiral Monroe echoed in his thoughts. "We have become stagnant," she had said, a phrase that gnawed at his conscience. The Kian High Council was no longer in unanimous agreement, and whispers of rebellion began to spread throughout the empire. Some of Zorak's most trusted generals questioned his strategy, wondering if continuing down the path of conquest was truly the answer. The loss to the humans had humbled them all, and they could no longer ignore the reality that their empire was falling behind. Zorak, however, remained. resolute in his belief that the Kian Empire could adapt. It was not too late. He had seen the potential of the human civilization, the ingenuity they possessed. The treaty they had proposed to shift toward cooperation, cultural exchange, and technological progress was an opportunity that the Kian Empire could not afford to pass up. But the question loomed over him: would the High Council accept this new path, or would they insist on maintaining the status quo of expansion and dominance? The turning point had arrived. Zorak called an emergency council session, knowing that his decision would shape the future of the entire empire. He understood now that the strength of the Kian Empire was not solely in its military might, but in its ability to adapt, evolve, and grow. This was the challenge he faced: to convince his people to embrace change, to abandon their old ways, and to evolve into something more than just conquerors. If he succeeded, perhaps the Kian Empire would finally be able to thrive in a universe that was rapidly changing around them. As the council session began, Zorak stood before the assembly of the most powerful beings in the Kian Empire. His 4 eyes surveyed the room, meeting the gaze of the high councillors, all of whom were eyeing him with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. The room was tense, filled with the hum of uncertainty. Zorak knew this moment was crucial. He had spent weeks preparing for it, gathering his thoughts, reconsidering every aspect of their ancient ways. "We are at a crossroads," Zorak began, his deep voice resonating through the chamber. "The Kian Empire has stood for thousands of years on the foundation of conquest, but we must face the fact that this path has left us stagnant. The humans have proven that innovation and curiosity, rather than brute force, are the key to survival and growth in this galaxy. The time for change has arrived." There was a murmur among the council members. Some nodded, while others looked uneasy. Zorak pressed on. "I propose that we embrace cooperation, scientific exchange, and cultural dialogue. We need to dedicate ourselves to research and development, redirecting our resources from constant military expansion to innovation. The Kian Empire has stagnated, and the humans, though they remain a species of one solar system, have made advances in technology, energy, and even space travel that we never imagined. We must learn from them, and we must evolve. The future of the Kian Empire depends on it." The room fell silent as his words settled into the air. This was not the Zorak they knew. The mighty commander who had never once questioned the Empire's dominance was now proposing a path of cooperation with the species they had once seen as inferior. There were whispers of dissent, but Zorak's gaze was unwavering. He knew this was the only way forward. The question now was whether the High Council could see beyond their pride and embrace the reality of this new era. Would they stand with him, or would they continue to cling to their old ways, risking the very survival of their species? Zorak waited, knowing the decision he made today could define the future of not just the Kian Empire, but of the entire galaxy. As the debate among the Kian High Council grew more intense, Zorak stood in the center of the chamber, his eyes unwavering, his body tense. He had made his proposal an offer of cooperation with humanity, a shift from the Empire's history of conquest to a future of growth, innovation, and partnership. But now, the decision was no longer in his hands alone. The council murmured among themselves, some expressing doubts, others hinting at approval, and a few voices calling for a return to the old ways. Zorak's mind raced as he listened to the arguments from every corner of the room. He had always led with power and strength, but now, he knew that the time for change had arrived. Finally, Arch-Councillor Vexa, the oldest and wisest member of the council, rose to speak. His many eyes fixed on Zorak, the weight of centuries of experience behind his gaze. "Zorak," Vexa began, his voice steady, but filled with gravitas. "You speak of change, of cooperation with the humans. You ask us to abandon the very foundation of the Kian Empire, our pursuit of conquest and dominance. Are we truly ready to reshape the galaxy in such a manner?" Zorak's heart raced as Vexa's words echoed through the chamber. He had anticipated resistance, but hearing it from Vexa, the one who had been the pillar of the Empire for so long, made it feel all the more real. But then, Vexa continued, his voice softening. "Perhaps it is time for us to rethink our path," he said, the words falling like a stone into the tense silence. "Perhaps it is time for us to evolve. You have seen what the humans have accomplished. Their innovation, their resilience, it is unmatched. If we do not adapt, we will be left behind." Zorak felt a flicker of hope. "I agree with Zorak," Vexa declared, his decision final. Let us explore this path of cooperation with humanity. Let us learn from them. The Kian Empire cannot continue as it has for the last 1,000 years. We must change, or we will fade into irrelevance. The other council members fell silent, each processing the monumental shift in direction. Slowly, others began to voice their agreement, one by one, until the entire chamber was in unanimous support of the proposal. Zorak exhaled deeply, the weight of the decision lifting from his shoulders. This was it. The Kian Empire had decided to turn a new page in its history. But as the council session concluded and Zorak walked out of the chamber, his mind turned to the future. What would the humans think of this sudden shift? Would they see the Kian Empire's willingness to change as a sign of strength or weakness? Zorak couldn't know yet, but one thing was certain. The galaxy was on the brink of a new era, one where cooperation might just prove more powerful than conquest.